Welcome to the Water Data Podcast, where we talk about the science, the stories, and the systems that shape our water future. I'm your host, Veena Srinivasan. Every couple of weeks, we'll chat about how better data and evidence can result in better decision making and ultimately better outcomes for people and the planet. So, if you're a student, a researcher, an innovator, a practitioner, or just curious about how we can better manage this precious resource, you've come to the right place. Let's get started.
This episode was recorded in 2021 but is seeing the light of day now in 2025 and still remains highly relevant. Our thanks to the forbearance of our guests, Kate Brauman and Sejal Worah. This episode is hosted by Veena Srinivasan alongside Nirat Bhatnagar of Dalberg Advisors.
Do check out the rest of the episodes to learn more about water data. In our previous episodes, we discussed the importance of water data, water quality, agriculture, and corporate stewardship. Today, we have with us Dr. Sejal Worah from the World Wildlife Fund and Dr. Kate Brauman from the Global Water Security Center at the University of Alabama. They're going to talk to us about environmental flows and the role of water in sustaining critical aquatic ecosystems.
Thanks for joining us today, Sejal and Kate. A real pleasure. There's a lot that we want to learn from you about your journeys, about your work. So without any further ado, I'm going to dive right into the first question. Let's start with your journeys. Can you share your journeys to the work that you do now? Both of you work at the intersection of water and different ecosystems. How did you get here? Maybe we start with Sejal and then Kate.
Thanks, Mitra. Thanks, Veena. Pleasure to be on this podcast, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. Good way to start. So, where does the journey begin? I've been in this field of conservation and development interface now for almost 35 years. And I didn't start as a water person. I started very much as a terrestrial person. In fact, I wanted to be a marine person. So my original desire was to be a marine biologist. And then I just discovered that I couldn't stand the smell or taste of fish. And so I had to veer away from that. And then, I became a terrestrial ecologist and, did my work. I studied in the US. I did my master's in the US. I came back to India. I did my PhD here. I worked mostly on the interface of looking at indigenous practices and conservation way back in the early 90s. I actually got interested and started moving into the water sector when I worked in Southeast Asia. So I was based in Bangkok for 5 years and I was working in Southeast Asia. And that's when the whole, so I visited quite a lot the Mekong countries and realized what an important role a river can play in the entire life of a nation. So it wasn't just about a few people and it wasn't about, a river or a stream. It was about these immense rivers that actually shape nations, shape history. And that's when I started getting interested in rivers during that time. When I came back to India and I started working with WWF India, WWF India had a long-standing program on wetlands for a very long time. They weren't actually working much on rivers, but wetlands had always been a priority for WWF and continues to remain so. And, it kind of pains me today that so few organizations, I know that ATRI is one of them, but so few organizations really focusing on wetlands still. And we're still losing wetlands at an incredible rate. So anyway, that's a different conversation. But anyway, so I got into wetlands as I came into WWF India. And one of our flagship programs at that time was a program on high altitude wetlands, which are some of the most amazing places on this planet. If you get a chance to visit these wetlands in the states of, in Ladakh, in Arunachal, in Sikkim, these are also incredible places. So that's where, the whole Water Connect started happening and I started recognizing the importance of water. But I think the issue that's linked most to this podcast and our work on environmental flows, that was actually a journey that started by chance. And, we about 17 years ago, we started a program on the Ganga. And frankly, we had no idea what we were getting into at that point in time. You can imagine how complex, how difficult, how crazy it seemed at that time to say, we're going to work on the Ganga and do something about, at that time, we didn't even know the word flows. People were just talking about cleaning the Ganga, right? It was, it still seems to be only cleaning the Ganga, but it was colleagues of ours from South Africa and the UK when we had a workshop in India to talk about what can we do that I first heard the term environmental flows and what it means. And we were captivated. It was suddenly a whole new world had opened up to us. And there was no looking back after that. Since then, we've actually been working on e-flows consistently. It was, I still remember that we started first talking about e-flows, even to the government. Nobody knew what we were talking about. The term was not even used or heard or understood. And for a long time, people just thought e-flows is about water quantity. So they kept saying, oh, it's water quality and water quantity, and e-flows is water quantity. And we kept trying to explain that it's much more complex than that. It's not just about water quantity, but it's taken us a long time. But we've stuck with it, and we've had a team working on environmental flows consistently now for almost 18 years. And today have had some really cool successes, and I hope we'll get a chance to talk about some of those. But, that's been my journey of, a wannabe marine biologist to somebody who's now fascinated and working with a team that is just pushing the bar, I think, on environmental flows in North India, at least. So that's me. Sorry, it was a long answer to a short question.
That's a fascinating answer, Sejal. Thanks for sharing that. And I'm sure we'll get a lot of time to discuss the case studies that you're talking about. Kate, what about your journey?
Well, I am thrilled to hear Sejal's story. And I also have a very indirect path to where I ended up today. I was not planning to get into environmental sciences at all, much less water. It just wasn't something that I had ever really thought about as an area that I could do work in. And after I graduated from college, mostly I needed a job. And I ended up working for the Natural Resources Defense Council, which, especially at the time, was mostly US based and really focused on the legal elements of the law. And I took a job in their membership and public education department. And I somehow became the person where if you sent an email asking a question about basically any topic at all, you got me. And so I spent a good number of years trying to find out the answers to sort of anything that popped into someone's head that they reached out to NRDC about. And it was fascinating. And it turned out to be just a great job because I was exposed to all kinds of things. And it was while I was at NRDC that I got really interested in the intersection between human well-being and environmental well-being and how these things work together and interplay, and started thinking a lot about both energy systems and water systems. And when I was thinking about going to graduate school and doing some more study, I, sat quietly. I really thought about, what do I want to do with my life? And I thought, I like rivers much more than I like power plants. And that was why I picked water. And it turned out to be a really great topic. I had never taken engineering classes before. I had never studied water. And so graduate school was quite a tour de force of learning a whole lot of new, exciting information. And as I started working on what I was going to get my PhD in, I got connected with a group working on ecosystem services. And through that, I was connected with some folks who were working on ecosystem services in Hawaii, on the big island of Hawaii, the islands in the Pacific. And they were really interested in water to complement some of the other ecosystem services that they were working on, cattle forage and carbon sequestration and different kinds of bird biodiversity. And they really wanted to complement this with water, which turned out to be an interesting problem because on that part of the big island of Hawaii, there actually is not a single perennial stream. It's an entirely groundwater-driven system. And it was an exciting and big field project where I learned a ton about really how terrestrial ecosystems affect water flow. So thinking about as we change between different land cover types, what does that mean for water resources below ground and also above ground? And that's really what's taken me on this journey, is thinking about what are we doing to the landscape? What does that mean for water? And then what does that in turn mean that we can do on the landscape? And it's been an unexpected but really fun journey to get here.
That's two really incredible stories. Kate, I think you missed an important piece of the story, which is what your undergraduate degree was in. Do you want to?
That's true. I was an independent major in science and religion.
And religion, exactly. So I think, and the reason I think this is interesting is because you have one of the most interesting stories starting from science and religion to actually water data, because that's really what your current role is. and Sejal's journey from going from oceans to and really upstream to rivers. I mean, two really fascinating stories. So, I mean, both of you kind of alluded to how you kind of started thinking about these problems much more broadly. And then at some point, kind of switched to kind of this issue of measurement and how do you define environmental flows and ecosystem services. And then what role does data play, eventually. And I know both your journeys kind of eventually led to a fairly serious focus on water data. So I was wondering whether you'd like each walk us through this journey on how data and measurement kind of became so important and started playing a role as part of your journey.
Before you asked about data, that you asked about my undergraduate degree, which was mostly comparative religions and microbiology. And in a funny way, I think it prepared me really well to get into this question about data, because the thing about data is that it's sort of meaningless until you figure out what it means. And the interpretation that comes both before the data gathering, the decisions about what is it that we want to measure, what are we collecting, have tremendous impact on then what does it mean that we have all of this data? What does it mean? How do we think about how that should influence the way we want to manage? And all of that on both the input side, the what do we measure, and the management side, what do we do about this, is totally values driven. And what I like about this interface is that I can, with enough data, with good models, I can tell you what's likely to happen, but I can never tell you if that's good or bad. That's a values-driven question that has to come from the folks who are using the water, living with the water, living with all the things that depend on the water. And so I think it prepared me really well to come to this question of working with and managing big data sets. And a lot of the work I do now is actually with global data sets, understanding what the strengths of those are, but also really what the weaknesses are. And those weaknesses come, from the beginning. What did we decide to measure? Why is this the indicator that we're using for something that we care about? But also, where are the measurements actually coming from? So in addition to global data sets, I've done a lot of work in the tropics and Hawaii and especially South America. And those are often very data poor places. And they're also often places where our models don't work as well. And so when we try to apply the quantitative things that we know, we have to be really careful and understanding what are we trying to get at and how did we make these decisions about the data that we gathered in the first place is really important. When you try to manage landscapes in the tropics in ways that make sense in temperate regions, it's entirely possible to get sort of backwards outcomes that you don't want. And thinking about that interplay between what are we measuring and why did we pick this thing to measure is really important.
That's really interesting. And that's kind of, taking us deep into the what and the why of data. And, when we started, I'll try and sort of illustrate this with a couple of examples, exactly what you said, Kate, about who uses that data and how does it impact lives. So when we started looking at the flows for the Ganga and trying to sort of assess and give recommendations for environmental flows for the Ganges. And this also brings in, Kate, your background on religion, because you know that the Ganges is the most holy river in India, and religion plays a big part in everything that's happening in the water there. So we were trying to take a bottom-up stakeholder-driven approach to try and understand, what are the flow requirements for wildlife, for species. So we were using indicator species like river dolphins and major carps and otters and stuff like that. But we were also, because the Ganges is such a iconic and culturally important river, we felt that cultural values also had to be integrated into the flows. And this was the first time, I believe, that anybody had tried to look at how do you assess flows from a cultural perspective. So we did lots of interviews. We met people, we met devotees, we met people who were, who live on the banks of the river, and started talking to them about what do flows mean to you. And it was fascinating because you would talk to a pilgrim and the pilgrim would say, the Ganges is a mighty river and it's a river where I don't want to see rocks. I want to see only water. So the flow of the Ganges should be enough to cover all the rocks, because the Ganges is overdrawn, and all you see now, you hardly see any water, you just see the rocks. So from a pilgrim point of view, he just said, I don't want to see the rocks. I want to see the mighty river flowing. And so we had to say, okay, now how do we convert that into cusecs? How do we convert, this person's perspective? Somebody else would say, well, because they have to do something called Achman. And that means that you have to be able to bend down and touch the water, and the water has to be within reach. Somebody else would say, well, it has to be up to the second step of the Ghats, and I have to be able to reach it easily to do Achman. So it's okay. So how do you convert that into flows? The most interesting one for us was we talked to a sadhu, a holy man who meditates on the banks of the river. And we said, what do flows mean to you? What would be an ideal flow for the Ganga to you? And he said, I have to be able to close my eyes and hear the roar of a mighty river. If I don't hear the roar of the river, then it's not the Ganga. So it's okay. How do you convert the roar of a river into million cusecs? So, this was a really fascinating approach to sort of look at it from bottom up and then look at data from a completely different angle, to say, how do you now take all these different requirements, all these different stakeholders' needs, and come up with a formula that's going to make sense to everyone. So that was fascinating. But having said that, and Veena will know this very well, getting access to data in India is a nightmare. So we, right from the beginning, and because the Ganges is a transboundary river, it's even more restricted. So you can forget about getting any data from any, so the government is collecting all this data, but, the hydrological data, the meteorological data, but we don't have access to any of it. We had to actually go and collect all our own flow data, which took us an enormous amount of time, cost a lot of money, but we had no option. So, we thought long and hard and said, how do we do it? Do we, just model it? Do we simulate it? Do we do X? Do we do Y? And we just came to the conclusion that we just had to collect the data ourselves because, it was the first time people were doing it. If we got it wrong, then we've messed up everything for a very long time to come. So I think it kind of, varies from one extreme to the other in terms of how you access the data, how you analyze it, how you use it, who uses it, who is it meaningful to. We learned a hell of a lot. I mean, the amount of letters we've written to the CWC, the CWC is the Central Water Commission, who holds all the data, begging, pleading, asking. But, again, it's become much easier now. So in 2013, the government passed the what was it called? The Data Sharing Act or something like that. And since then, if you can justify and you can give a reason and you can explain and all of that stuff, you do get access to data. So we've actually started getting better access to data. Now, how reliable it is, you don't know, but that's what you have. And you've got to work with what you have, right? So yeah, so things are a lot better now than they were 15 years ago when we started. And we were at a loss. I honestly didn't think we would be able to do any of this work because without data, what do you do? Where do you go? It just becomes meaningless. But yeah, it's been a long journey, but we're getting there slowly.
I love this challenge of trying to translate the experience of the river into flow.
Right.
And that's exactly what I love about the ecosystem services framework, because it really translates these data-driven scientific things that I think are often really hard to understand into what does this mean for you? Why should I care?
Exactly. So it's kind of cool to be able to do it from both ends.
Yeah.
So you do it from the science end and stuff, but if it doesn't translate to the normal person, it's not going to make any sense. So I think we learned a lot in terms of just trying to translate data into something meaningful that people can relate to.
Yes, can I ask a follow-up question before we... So Sejal, actually, I know that you talked about the data. I didn't actually know that you guys had done all of these flow measurements. But I do know that you also worked a lot with citizen-managed data. And then one of the really amazing things about your work is all of the work that you've done on like aquatic ecosystems and so on. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about those other types of data, which is the citizen-collected data and what you've done.
So I used to be quite a skeptic of citizen-collected data and citizen science, right? Because for whatever reasons, I won't go into the history of that, but I kind of wonder, being very scientific, in those days and being very technical, I was like, yeah, but that's not accurate. You can't do anything with that data. You can't work with data that's not accurate. What does it mean? So I used to be a little bit skeptical. But, since we started working on this work in some of the cities where these rivers are flowing and trying to get citizens engaged. Because at the end of the day, all of this will matter only if people speak up, only if people care for rivers and they speak up, right? And they will care for them when they see what's happening, when they get engaged and involved. So we started this program called, the Ganga Mitras and the Ganga Mitras. Mitra means friend. And it was actually quite amazing because, we went to places which were, oh God, the dregs. I mean, we went to cities like Muradabad. I can't explain to you what sort of a city it is. It's a city where the river is pretty much dead as it flows through the city. It's a city which the city itself is feels hopeless, when you walk into it. And when we started talking about the river to people in Muradabad, you should have seen the response. I mean, I was stunned because basically they just said, nobody has ever cared. Nobody has ever cared about us, our town, or our river. You guys are the first people who actually come and said that something can be done about it. And so we created this group, and it was everybody. It was school teachers, it was doctors, it was farmers, it was, anybody who cared about the river could just come together. And then we did we trained them on measuring flows, pollution, levels of BOD, COD, just simple measures, and explained what this means. If it's going up or down, what does it mean about the health of your river? So we started talking about river health. So the word that we used, it was not flows, it was not pollution, it was nothing. It was just about the health of your river. And then you relate it to the health of your body, right? So people started relating to the river like they related to their own body. And they were checking, they were measuring, they were taking the government to task, they were writing reports, they were setting out scorecards. I mean, it just became a movement. And again, we realized that people care. It's just that there's no avenue. And if you bring science and data down to people, they will engage. It's nothing. It's not magic. It's not rocket science. It's something everyone can relate to if you just simplify it. And we just made really simple tools. But at the end of the day, it's data-driven. It's still data-driven, but it's driven by normal, ordinary people who have an interest and a passion, but not necessarily trained in science. It's really, these guys are crazy. It's, they're there every time we want them. They'll gather together. It's lasted for a long time. So it's not been just a flash in the pan kind of project-driven thing. So, yeah.
I wonder, too, if part of it is that it's the data, it's the water data, it's the flow data, but it's also linking that biophysical data that I think as hydrologists, we often get that far and then we stop because we're like, we have the hydrograph, we have the measurement.
Right.
And it's taking it that one step further to impact.
Yeah.
What does it mean that the peak of the hydrograph is here? Well, it means you see the rocks, you don't see the rocks. What does it mean that this is the VOC? Well, it means the fish that you want to see are there or they're not there.
Yeah. Or your boat goes across the river or gets stuck halfway across the river. It's simple stuff like that. And they're like, oh yeah, you're right. We have to take the boats on a big detour these days because the water's gone. And so, so flow starts coming alive to all of them in different ways. It was the buffaloes crossing at one time. I remember the buffaloes were crossing the river under the bridge, and it was completely polluted and black and flowing. And the buffaloes were up to their ankles in the water. And this guy, old man, he's looking at them crossing and he says, I remember when the buffaloes had to swim across the river. And, I wish we could have that river back. So it was, so many little things. And it's all linked to flows, right? At the end of the day. So, yeah.
This is fascinating. Sejal, thanks for sharing. And actually a good segue into the question I wanted to ask about. If you know of any case studies, if you know of any examples where data and narratives, right? So not just the numbers, but also the human stories, the narratives around water, how they actually shape different kinds of decisions, which are ultimately sustainable, right? And decisions not just in water, but also in agriculture, also, let's say, in waste management, right? And not just decisions that individuals take or families take, but also institutions take, right? So are there any sort of case studies that you have that are worth kind of talking about?
So my experience is not in India, but I can talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done in South America, in the Andes and in the Brazilian Atlantic forest. And there's a growing number of programs in that area that are sometimes called water funds or investments in watershed services, payments for ecosystem services. And we did a really interesting project where we were working with folks who were actually running these projects. They'd already been set up and they were doing data collection themselves and trying to understand better about how some of the ecosystem management they were doing was affecting the flows of water. but at the same time, also really working with, who are the folks on the ground that are implementing this? Who are the folks who are making decisions about what happens? And then, who are the residents, the people living upstream that are participating in these programs, and why are they doing it? And the narrative that you hear, especially in the United States, about some of these payments for ecosystem services programs is that they're very data driven and they're very economically driven, that this is a transactional payment, that the water users are going to pay the upstream participants and they're going to change what they're doing and that's going to improve the water flow. And it's this like very economically perfect feedback cycle. And what we discovered when we really started talking to folks who were making the decisions about what to do with these programs, and then also really talking to people that lived in the watersheds who were participating in these programs, is that the reasons that people were getting involved were much more nuanced. And they had much more to do with people's relationships with water and the land around them, how they themselves understood and saw evidence of what they were doing, and their relationships with the people who are actually doing the management of the programs themselves. And that we even met some folks who had more money than they were able to spend because they couldn't get participants to work with the water department in one area because they didn't have relationships like that. And then other places where these relationships are deep and long. And that's really what's driven the success of the programs. And so, the multiple layers of narrative is part of what came out. How do you get US investors to put money into these things is a very different narrative, and often a more data-driven narrative than how do we actually get people to participate? What are the possibilities and constraints on the ground as we think about where to invest or what activities to do in terms of land management? And how do people's relationship with the land around them and the water around them, how does that affect their willingness to engage in these kinds of programs? We've learned a lot, and you do need the data, but you need so much more than the data to actually make these projects work.
Yeah, that's a super, super interesting distinction that you make about the use of data in almost market-based activity and transactions versus, let's say, non-market, hyperlocal activity, almost where behaviors change, but there may not be any market transaction, right? And how in that hyperlocal kind of environment, relationships really are the foundation on which these stories will then shift, drive change. Any example that you can sort of maybe, any tangible example that, let's say, led to very large-scale change?
One of the projects we've worked with in Colombia is called Agua por la Vida, Water for Life. And this is a long-standing project that has evolved in quite interesting ways out of infrastructure investments in the region to sugarcane growers who live closer to the valley floor that are the primary water users, and then the people who live further up the mountains on small farms, often with cattle, and smaller villages that are up the mountains. And there's a whole series of river basin management committees. And one of our collaborators and friends, Emilio Vargas, has done just an amazing job over almost 20 years, forming relationships with many of these folks who are upstream and trying to understand what it is that they want, what's actually happening with the ecology and the hydrology of these watersheds, and really putting that all together to help identify what and where they can do different kinds of, often it's fencing or it's reforestation, but it would be reforestation with fruit-bearing trees and not timber trees, so that you can make an income from the trees and also keep them in place. So lots of really, really interesting different kinds of projects that have evolved out of this. And they've been very successful. This is a long-standing water fund.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks for sharing that. Sejal, any examples that stand out for you about how data and narratives have really shifted the behavior of either large institutions, governments, or even communities?
Let me give a little bit of an out-of-the-box example. It's linked to the Kumbh Mela, and which is so. Kate, just for your information, the Kumbh Mela is a religious gathering, right? It's the largest religious gathering in the world. Up to 200 million people gather on the banks of the river Ganges on certain auspicious days every 12 years. And every year there's a smaller one, but every 12 years there's a huge one. In 2019, there were up to 50 million people in one day who actually went to bathe in the river, the ritual bathing. It's kind of pretty mind-boggling, the whole scale of the thing. For a long time for the Ganges, we've been talking about flows in the lean season. And the Kumbh Mela happens over several weeks, 3 months almost, in the lean season, in the summer. So we'd been talking about flow releases and we'd done all the calculations, we'd done all the metadata, we'd gathered all this, detailed information, done all the analysis and come up with the flow requirements for the river and had been lobbying with the government to say this is, what the flow requirements are. There's multiple barrages upstream which actually block the river. So by the time it reaches this place where the, Haridwar, where the Kumbh is happening, about 60% of the water is already diverted. So you have a really lean river with most of the water diverted to irrigation canals. The response of the government always was, we can't divert water away from farmers because, this is all for agriculture and farmers are a huge, important constituency and a stakeholder. And if we put this flow into the river, farmers will be deprived. So we can't, release the flows that you guys are asking for. Fine. So we continue, we struggle, this, that. Then comes the Kumbh Mela. And suddenly flows are released massively into the river for the pilgrims, right? Because they have to bathe and these 200 million people have come for a dip in the river and there's no way the river is not going to be flowing at that point in time. So all the barrages are opened, flows are released, water is flowing, not a peep from the farmers. Okay, so we turn around and we said, hang on a minute, you said that farmers will complain if they don't get the water, but you've been releasing water for weeks now for the festival and farming is still going on. Irrigation is still going on. So what's the issue here? Doesn't this mean that you should be able to release this every year, not just on the year when there's a Kumbh? So this was the argument that we used with them and kind of pushed the data and the information. And so we looked at the Kumbh, we measured the flows during the Kumbh, and we essentially, told the government that this is the flow requirement, even if it's not the full amount. You should be able to release far more water into the river than you are releasing, because obviously irrigation and farming and religious sentiment can all go together on certain days of the year, but why not every day? So that was an interesting use of data. We never thought that this is how we would be using the data. And it was a precursor to us being able to then talk to the other, to the tributary managers of the river, the irrigation departments, to talk about release of water and flows. And now, at least for one of the tributaries, the major tributary we've been working with, there's been a government order, which essentially orders the irrigation department to release the flow requirements that we have measured and given them since 2021. So we did actually change the needle, shift the needle in that sense. And it was interesting because this year, so they released the water in 2021 because they had the government order. In 2022, they went back to the old one. So they stopped releasing water because that's how they work. They just hate this stuff, being forced to do X, Y, Z when they've been doing it a certain way. So we went out, we did our measurements because we are monitoring the situation all the time and checked and found that they hadn't released water this year. So we went up to them and we said, hey, what's going on? There's a government order and you have to. And they were like, oh, we thought that was only for 2021. And so we pointed out that it's not for 2021, it's from 2021. So then they recognized it and released the water. And it was, for my team, I can't tell you, these are emotional moments because we never, when we started working on flows, we really thought that we're going to be stuck in a theoretical exercise. We didn't imagine that we would be in a situation where we would actually see the government opening barrages and dams to release water into the river based on information, data, and the science that we had collected. So it was hugely emotional, I must say, for my team to actually see this happening. And I remember the WhatsApps and everything they kept sending me, and they said, this is like a dream come true. Seeing this barrage open and the water flows coming out is amazing. And it has been, because it's been, a 12, 13-year journey. But we have reached a stage where we're influencing, flows in rivers. So yeah, data can drive big change if you're persistent.
That's a fascinating example, Sejal. And we'll come back to a question on ecosystem services. But I think what I found really interesting was that the cultural value of water was valued in this case, right? So there was a lot of cultural religious value, and somehow you made the case around that, and then through that got into an irreversible kind of solid kind of equilibrium.
Yeah.
Important to think about data and also the advocacy narrative creatively. And figuring out what argument will work and not just relying on the economic argument all the time.
Exactly. I think that was the lesson for us. It was a big lesson for us because we're always on the economic argument, right? That we think that that's the one that's going to work. But in India, and particularly for the Ganges, the cultural arguments seem to actually play a very significant role.
And I love how the cultural argument was the push, and then the data collection gave it that context.
Exactly. You had to have that data. Without the data, it would just be, it wouldn't have worked. So it was a combination of the fact that we had the data to prove, what the flows should be and the monitoring. I think for us in the work on flows, the most important thing has been the consistent monitoring, to just see the fluctuations and to see what's going on and be on the ball, when things are not going right and be able to point it out. So yeah, and it's hard work.
Demonstrate that you can have water in the river flowing and also have irrigation. That it's not an either or.
Yeah, and the problem with us in India is, of course, the inefficiency of the irrigation, right? The inefficiency of the canal system, the inefficiency of the way people are using water, the over-subsidized nature of water. So all of this kind of drives inefficiencies, and you need to address that as well. So we have a really nice example of how we've addressed that and also got a river flowing again, just based on making agriculture more efficient and water use more efficient. So yeah, it's all these, one of the things I learned, and I have to share this, one of the things I learned when we started this work is the incredible canal network in this country. I had no idea. I had no idea how the canal system works. And, it's like a human body. It's like a whole blood system, with capillaries and veins and arteries and this and that. And the thing is, if we manage that system well, it would work incredibly well. It's just that the system has been mismanaged and misused and fallen into decay. And, some places it works and some it doesn't. But it was just fascinating for me to realize how complex it is.
This is one of my big questions, though, about data and where I hope we can go with data collection. Because, when we talk about inefficiencies in water, and especially water in agriculture, that water is always going somewhere. And I think we often don't know where it's going. But I would wager that someone is probably using that water wherever it's gotten to. I know in the United States, for example, there are leaky canals and arid places that have unbelievably biodiverse ecosystems along the edges.
Yeah.
Return flows, groundwater recharge, that we're not accounting for it in ways that let us manage it, but we're also often using it. And I particularly get concerned about when we think about increasing efficiency, and that then has the potential for cutting off the users who we're not accounting for. And those users are often really underprivileged. They're folks who don't have the first rights to water, the first use, and they're dependent on that. And that's actually often been people who are using ecosystems. So people who are using wetlands, for example. And when we cut off those water flows in the name of efficiency, we can have really perverse impacts both on ecosystems, but also on the people who are using the wastewater. And so I'm really excited about data and better understanding where these leaky systems are leaking to, and what does it mean when we change them?
Yeah. Just on that, Kate, I'd love to know, the last couple of years have been a terrible, terrible water-wise, right? For California, for Western US. Have you seen the way data and narratives, water data and narratives, have you seen a change in the way they're getting used? Also, this whole leak system thing, this unintended beneficiaries who are not accounted for. Have you seen any of that happen in the US in the last couple of years?
There are definitely narratives about this in the US. And there are, again, this is a place where there's conflicting narratives that are quite interesting. It's very clear that the US is in a terrible drought, the Western US. This is probably a drought of record. It's certainly a drought of record. It's probably a drought of longer than record. And we're seeing reservoir levels drop precipitously. people are very, very concerned about water scarcity. It's very much in the news. What gets left out of that, so there's a big focus on climate and rainfall and the supply side. There's much less conversation about the demand side and how that has changed over time and the increase in that over time. So the conservation focus ends up being super local. This is what you can do at home. Don't wash your car, don't water your lawn. There's some of it is about agriculture. It tends to be very urban focused. It tends to be very climate change focused. And yet, if you look at California, somewhere more than 80% of all of the water use in the state goes to agriculture. You look at a place like Arizona, it's actually higher, I believe. And so there's a real mismatch in some ways. The narrative is important. I think it's got people paying attention to climate change. It has people thinking about scarcity, but it doesn't integrate the balance of that, the supply side, the demand side balance of that very well. And so I think that has some real benefits. And then it also causes us to overlook some really important solutions to some of these problems. The other piece that's quite interesting, I read some beautiful work recently that was interviewing a whole range of people throughout California's Central Valley. So this is an area that's been really hit hard by water restriction and the wide range of narratives about what's happening, some of which absolutely are blaming water shortage and agricultural impacts on the government and environmental restoration, some of which are very focused on what's happening with agriculture and agricultural water management. There's a real range of narratives that I think probably really reflect people's values and their vision for what a positive future should look like. And so, again, there's not one narrative. And it seems to me that any kind of solution is going to have to try to interweave those narratives so that people do participate in the solutions.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, right? About how narratives on water are deeply kind of personal, they're deeply different, and how easy it would be to weaponize those narratives, right? There's so many things that different people have a very, I would say, justified claim on in terms of water. In India, we're having very similar debates on, let's say, river linking, right? So it's going to be super, super easy for this to become like classic information warfare. And how do you sort of guard against that? How do you still have data-based decisions getting taken? I mean, that will be really important. Sejal, you want to come in?
No, I just wanted to respond to the earlier comment on, efficiency and what it means for maybe people who are marginalized, and maybe greater efficiency is not necessarily the greater good. So again, in India, it's quite interesting because a lot of our canal systems, which are so-called inefficient, are unlined canals, right? So they're just natural canals. They're almost like natural ecosystems in their own right. So in that sense, I would hate to see these changed into which they're planning to do now and make them into concrete lined canals, because then you're losing a lot of those services that these canals are providing. But one of the things that we found in terms of the inefficiencies is an overutilization upstream is what happens to the downstream users, right? So this particular river tributary that we've been working on with the farmers on efficiency, increasing irrigation efficiency basically, is to ensure that the guys at the end of the canal are also getting water, because they have actually not had water for the last 15 years because upstream users are basically using it all up and not letting it flow downstream. So the whole point of this particular pilot was to show how more efficient use of water upstream actually gets water back into the canals and allows downstream users, the end users, to also get water. So it is about equity rather than inequity. So it all depends, right? It all depends on what your end goal is in terms of increasing efficiency. And in this case, it's worked really well. And we were so impressed because these guys actually, throughout the COVID period, kept these practices going and kept the water flowing in this river, which actually had not seen water for 15 years. So yeah, there's ways and ways of managing that kind of a situation. But I agree with you that let's also be very careful that we're not, losing it by trying to sort of manage this over efficient kind of system. You're not losing the plot. But it's a really good point. And I just want to also, ensure that we are cognizant of it at all times, because we do get caught up in the efficiency narrative.
Can I jump in and say, for a moment, both of you really sound like engineers, and I know that you're also ecologists. So I I know, obviously I'm familiar with both of your work, but I know Sejal, Kate just talked about this idea of leakages and basically what it does to sustain ecosystems. And then I know that, WWF has done such great work in terms of I think what is really unique, and you started off the podcast talking about what there is very little of, which is on the ecological side, right? Just understanding what when we say environmental flows, you started right at the beginning saying it's not a number. And I know as a hydrologist, we get excited about numbers, but I think what's incredible about both of your work is how you've tried to understand the term of what ecosystems mean in a much more nuanced way. And I was hoping both of you would speak to that bit as an example, saying it's not just a hydrograph, it's not just a 5% of flows.
I'm just reading a message from somebody in my team, which is related to what you just said. If you don't mind, I'll just read it out because it kind of sort of answers your question. So this is a colleague of mine who's he's our e-flows guy. And I asked him about this issue of data and e-flows. And this was his response. He basically said, data and conclusive information with regard to hydraulic habitat requirements like water depth, channel width, and velocity for aquatic species is just not available. This has been one of the biggest challenges that we have faced in our work of e-flows assessments. But what has worked is partnerships. So he brings in the fact that the way to overcome this data deficiency was through partnering with a whole range of institutions. And I think this is something I didn't mention earlier, and I do want to emphasize the fact that all of our e-flows work initially and even now is because of the incredible partnerships we had. We had research institutions, we had experts, we had water institutions, we had social institutions, and all of these guys came together to actually define these requirements, especially for the species, right? So he says the team has managed to define this thanks to the input of all these research institutions and different partners and everybody coming together. The wealth of experience of the experts in the concerned river systems and for specific species, including snow trout, marcy, dolphins, Indian carps, proved really helpful in solving the puzzle. Nevertheless, this is an area of research which not many organizations and researchers are venturing into. We are trying to now conduct a threshold study to establish the hydraulic requirements for dolphins in the Upper Ganga river stretch, which will be the first time that this is being done. So this is basically the answer, Veena, to your question, is trying to get this for ecosystems and species, wildlife species, is incredibly difficult because it's, again, we're starting from scratch. We're actually defining threshold values. We don't even know what the requirements of these species are. We don't even know their behavior. So it's almost impossible to define a flow requirement for a species when you don't even understand its behavior throughout the year. When it spawns, when it goes upstream, when it goes downstream, what depth it needs at what time, what kind of velocity of flow it needs, it's so unique and nuanced that we are struggling with this because there's just very generic information. But this kind of nuanced information, especially on velocities, certain species need a certain velocity of water, to be able to spawn, to be able to do X, to be able to feed. You know how it is with research on that kind of stuff. No one's doing it.
Yeah. I think about this in two really interlinked, but in some ways deeply opposite ways. So one piece of the puzzle is that there's just not the kind of data that we need to make a lot of these decisions. In an ideal world with infinite money and measurement equipment and people to deploy it and interpret the data, we could describe amazing things.
Yeah.
And that's never going to happen. It's just not. We can certainly do much better than we're doing right now, but we're never going to have a perfect description of the world. And so we have to figure out how to make decisions and think about impact in a world of uncertainty. And that uncertainty comes partly from, there's just all this measurement uncertainty. There's stuff we just don't know, as well as, the changing drivers and the uncertainty that comes from that's inherent in the system itself. At the same time, I think it's important that we remember as we think about this and we think about impact that there's actually probably not a right answer, a threshold number for most of these things. The kinds of species that we're interested in are adaptable and they thrive over a wide range of conditions. And we definitely know when the water levels are too low and too slow and too dirty, that's bad. But is there some magic number above which it's fine? The answer is probably not. And so we need to embrace adaptive management. We need to really think about every time we want to make some kind of a change, a land management change, a water extraction change, a barrage opening change. Is this going to make a difference? Is this going to help or hinder? Is it going the direction we want? Do we think that impact's going to be big or small? And what's the trade-off? Are we talking about trading off some tiny benefit for some big loss, or some big benefit for some tiny loss? I really, even in a world of perfect data, I'm not convinced that we could quantify some of these things the way my little engineering heart wants to. That it's not, if you do this, it's going to, reduce reproductive potential by 13%. We're not going to get there with the data. And I'm not even sure it's possible. And so thinking about this is going to have a negative, but large negative or small negative impact. This is going to have a big positive, a really big positive impact, are the way we need to start thinking about these kinds of trade-offs and management decisions.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I completely agree with that, because this is the flip side of it, right? So we have different members in our teams, and we have the guys who are purely intuitive and will just rush off and do something based on minimal knowledge but lots of experience. And then you have the other extreme, the guys who are anal and just want every bit of data collected and everything analyzed and everything before they will even come to any conclusion. So the reality obviously lies somewhere in the middle. We're never going to have all the data. And this is something that I argue with the teams all the time. It's never going to be perfect. Don't keep asking me to spend more and more and more and more money on research and more equipment and more storage devices. And, just collecting more data is not going to solve the problem. So I completely agree that we've got to look at the trade-offs. We've got to be smart about it. You need minimal but sufficient information to be able to make smart decisions. And I think that's the mantra by which we just have to, work in the field that we're in. Yeah.
Yeah. Do we know enough to answer the question we want to answer?
Yeah. In a fairly reasonable fashion. Maybe not 100%, but yeah, it's as long as you're comfortable with it. Yeah. Yeah. And then adapt, and adapt, modify, be on the ball, monitor. That's the best we can do.
So let me ask a follow-up to that, and also linked to the ecosystem services framework, right? So both of you have worked using the ecosystems framework in slightly different ways, but for many, many years. So two-part question. One is, how have you seen the use of the ecosystem frameworks, the ecosystem services framework change over the last 10 to 20 years, right? How are you seeing it getting applied right now? And then I'll bring in the finance angle. A lot of, let's say, decisions, financial decisions, ESG kind of decisions are being taken, accounting for some of these services, right? So, and in a world where one actually does not have perfect data, and yet one needs to think about trade-offs, right? So should we do X or should we do Y? And like we just discussed a few minutes ago, different people value different things, even in water, right? So how does one think about applying the ecosystem services lens in a nuanced way in a world with imperfect information, right? And especially when there are competing uses, you might have actors in agriculture, you might have actors in energy who'll argue that, look, invest in this, it has more value than your water project.
Well, I'll start with the first half of your question, which is, how has this changed? When I started out working on and thinking about ecosystem services, there was a real focus on economic valuation and really trying to tie biophysical changes to monetary values. And the field was heavily dominated by folks in ecology and economics. And I think there was a lot of benefit in that. There was also a lot of pushback. A lot of people who said, you're trying to put a value on nature. And where I've seen the field evolve, I think is really positive. And it takes what I've always seen as the core of the idea of ecosystem services, which is, let's get to impact. Why do I care? How is this affecting the things that I care about? How is this affecting me and the way that I can function in the world? And it's kept that heart of it, but started to look and understand more broadly to get at the different ways that people value and interact with the environment around us. And so that was a big part of the motivation for the IPBES assessment. So that's the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So big intergovernmental, really assessment project that's looking at the state of nature and the way that nature affects people. And IPBES very actively has embraced a change in terminology to nature's contributions to people. And that's a lot of words, but so is ecosystem services. What I really like about it, though, is that it's a really active approach to opening the door wider, to saying to more scientists, so social scientists and humanitarians and hydrologists. There's not a whole lot of hydrologists in the ecosystem services community, it turns out. Bringing in more academic perspectives and also bringing in other perspectives. There's a real focus on Indigenous and local knowledge and how all of these inform our understanding. Some of it we're probably never going to be able to put a dollar value on. But by articulating what is it that I actually care about, it, I think, becomes possible to engage in conversation. And it's okay for me to care about something different than you care about. That's normal. But we can come together and say, we understand that the flow of this river affects what I care about and what you care about. How do we come to some kind of compromise? And that, to me, is really the heart of ecosystem services. And it's why I love it so much. You know, my standing joke is that while I actually know quite a few people who deeply personally care about the nitrogen cycle, the vast majority of the rest of humanity cares about, is my water safe to drink? Does it have the animals that I want in it? How is that affecting vegetation that I care about? You know, it gets us out of a science bubble and out of a data bubble into a conversation about how does this affect the world around us and the world that we are part of.
Yeah, I love that answer. Sejal, anything you'd like to add?
Well, I'm just thinking about the narrative and, where we are, because, as large organizations, we also tend to go with the current defining narrative on whether it's ecosystem flow services or, XYZ. So I have seen the narrative shift in these large environmental, global organizations very much. So ecosystem services, you hardly hear anymore. It's kind of replaced by all kinds of other terminology. And the big one, of course, right now is nature-based solutions, which goes back to the whole thing about nature's contributions to people. And if I want to be cynical about it, to me, the whole nature-based solution argument, while it's very popular right now, is also linked to this other big buzzword. And the other big thing that you just alluded to, Neera, is the whole bankable projects thing. So it's about money. It's about big money and how to leverage and mobilize big money towards what ostensibly is nature-based solutions and valuing ecosystem services. But my fear is that it's actually going to potentially have the opposite impact. So I'm quite wary about this whole shift. We're part of it, and we're looking at, bankable projects is the big thing. Everybody's funding them. People are coming to us and saying, give us ideas for bankable projects based on nature-based solutions or, ecosystem services and stuff. And how do I put it? It's a little bit scary because the jury is out as far as I'm concerned in terms of what this shift is going to mean for people and for nature. So I'm just holding on this one, if that's okay.
I'm not going to disagree with anything you just said, but I will say I love that water sustainability, environmental sustainability, nature-based solutions are coming into the lexicon.
Yeah, it's mainstreaming. Yeah, for sure.
Finance and mainstream.
Yeah.
Because I think it means people are taking it seriously in a way that maybe they haven't before. And moving from compliance. Somebody told me I had to, so I'm just following the rules, to actually trying to be a little more forward-looking and positive. So that piece of it, the narrative piece of it, I actually really like. The measurement and payback parts, I also worry about. While I am simultaneously a big believer in the contributions of nature to people, I've done a lot of research, I've seen the contributions. If you've got a very specific water goal, there's a reason that people have built infrastructure for millennia. When you do that, you get a clear and measurable, with the tools that we have invented over the last millennia to measure those impacts, you get the benefits that you're looking for because you designed for them and you designed measurement tools to measure those exact benefits in that exact way. Trying to just repurpose those same tools and approaches for nature-based solutions, I don't know how well it's going to work. I think we might need to kind of think bigger about the whole system instead of just slotting this new thing in.
Yeah. So I think it does. As you said, I think it requires a bit more thinking through, or maybe a lot more thinking through.
I guess we're going to be busy.
Yeah. I think, since we're coming to the top of the hour, maybe we should kind of wrap up and ask, I don't know, Nirat, if you feel like we've covered financing models and so on. I think we've actually done, a lot of the stuff that we had on our wish list to cover. But maybe one way for us to end this conversation, since both of you kind of called for, don't try to just repurpose old tools for these big new ideas, whether you kind of had a wish list for what, the whole sector needs to do, just to do better in this entire space. And broadly, we mean, how, whether you want to call it ecosystem services, nature-based solutions, whatever it takes, which is the interaction between water and nature very, very broadly. So do you want to each kind of give your thoughts on what is the top 3-4 things that need to be done for that transition to happen better? The thing that's going to keep you all in business for the next, 20 years.
I would just say one thing, actually, instead of 3-4 things. Kate, I'll let you have the last word. I just want to pick up on what you said just now and follow through on that, because I think that would be an ideal scenario, which is if it genuinely got mainstreamed. I think if water ecosystem services, contributions of nature genuinely got mainstreamed into decision making, and that means multiple decision making, right? It means finance, it means planning, it means all of that, and actually getting integrated into the way things are done. So the way things are operationalized at a large scale, at a national level, or in India at a state level, that would be, the ideal scenario for me, because right now it's still far from that. As you said, Kate, there's some acceptance, there's some understanding. I think at the global level, it's getting integrated into a lot of thinking. Yes, the G7 is talking about it. Yes, the G20 is now suddenly talking about nature-based solutions. All that is great. And we see those as indicators and we go, yay, it's happening. But when you actually see on the ground, our governments actually putting their money where their mouth is, our planning systems taking into account any plan, even a city level plan where there's a river flowing through a city, is it integrating that river into the city, into the planning, into the design, into the funding, into the budgets? If that would happen, then that's what we're trying. But if that would happen, that would be a dream.
I will echo that. I think about 2 things. So, the first is just to come back around to the water data podcast. We, as in humanity, projects are being put into place all the time that affect water flow through ecosystems, so terrestrial water flow and in-stream flows. But we almost never measure that impact, which means that when we think about nature-based solutions, especially at scale, we have almost no data to predict what we think is actually going to happen at scale. And so the first item in my wish list is actually that we would just do some low-key measuring and monitoring of the water impacts of basically any project that anyone's doing anywhere all the time. It doesn't have to be really intense, but I would love to see some more big scale, measurements of big scale projects that are probably not water projects. People are doing them for other reasons. But if we had a better handle on the hydrologic impacts of that, I would love to see that. So more data. But then on the flip side, the second item on my wish list, I think, would be, almost exactly what Sejal said, which is that we need to integrate water and impacts on water into this wide range of decisions that aren't specifically water decisions. And I'm not convinced we really know how to do that yet. How do we think about water and finance? How do we think about water and security? We know it matters. We know it's not deterministic. It's somewhere in between, and we're not yet doing a good job of really integrating water into those other kinds of decisions that we think about as non-water decisions. And there's so much potential. We're so close. I'm really excited about where that's headed.
So close and yet so far.
Like I said, we're going to keep busy, right?
That was just fantastic. I really, really enjoyed this chat, guys. Really inspirational. That's what I would say. Neeraj?
Yeah, no, I really, really enjoyed it as well and covered so much ground. So thank you, Sejal, and thank you, Kate, for this. I was listening and thinking very deeply about all that you guys said.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Water Data Podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to share the show with your friends and colleagues. If you want to watch the show instead, head over to the Well Labs YouTube channel. Until then, stay curious and stay connected. Thank you.